Please welcome Victoria Raish as your presenter.
Yes, thank you very much. And that was, Courtney, that was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I'm also going to use a polling feature, but mine's actually Nearpod. So if you go, I'm going to swap over to that screen, and now you should see Nearpod as your screen share. So there is a code there at the top. And so if you either you have the app on your phone or you can go to join.nearpod.com and you enter that code in the app. And like Courtney, I'm just going to wait a minute for everyone to do that. If you don't want to participate in the polling, I have a couple open-ended questions as well. That's okay. You can just follow along. But if you want to participate, this is how that will be possible. And because of the way that I'm sharing my screen, I won't be utilizing the discussion forum too much within the course of my presentation. But if you have any questions, make sure to ask them and we'll have plenty of time at the end to discuss them. And while everybody's getting started on that, just a bit about me. I am the online learning coordinator for Penn State University in the university libraries. And so I try to think strategically about how fellow librarians and information professionals can partner and get involved with instructional efforts in the online learning realm. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of this, but you can still see, and I see 4 people have joined here. You can still join just with this code at the top. The code at the top will stay here the entire time. Oh, lots of people came in. Okay, great. So I'm going to get started in the presentation then, since we have such a short time together. So my presentation is about being new to online teaching. So I am under the assumption that people that are listening to this presentation are in some capacity defining themselves as new to online teaching. So I've been involved in online learning and teaching since 2008. Actually, really good connection to the first presentation. My very first online class in 2008 was Organic Chemistry 2 lab. Organic chemistry was my favorite class, and if I wasn't so scared of the chemicals, I definitely would have majored and done a lot more with organic chemistry. Wasn't so scared in lab. Uh, Online learning has come a long way since then, especially the software for things like science labs. Actually, that was my dissertation too, so I think we have a lot in common. But yeah, so I have this question here about the type of teaching you do the most and think about in a non-pandemic year. So of the people who are choosing to participate in the polling, it looks like about 33% mostly teach, 40% mostly teach face-to-face, and a quarter teach online, and then nobody teaches hybrid in a normal circumstance. And I understand we could spend the next 3 hours talking about what hybrid actually means. But in this sense, it is some mix between in-person and online instruction. So not students here and students there, but you do some stuff online and then some stuff you meet in the classroom. Okay, so it looks like we have a pretty even split here. So I'm gonna move on. Next slide, which talks about our overview. So I'm going to talk a bit about what makes online learning, what makes that a good experience, a high quality experience. And this is for, remote teaching, quote unquote, or more traditional online learning, which it's funny if you've been in the field for a while to say traditional online learning. A little bit about instructional design in a nutshell, in terms of thinking about how instructional design supports quality online learning, and then some engagement and interactive strategies, both for synchronous and asynchronous online learning strategies. And through all of this, we'll talk about it with a frame towards how long it takes to prepare to teach online learning, what you can do upfront that takes more time investment upfront, but then ultimately pays off in terms of quality, experience, engagement, and time in the long run, and then how you can gather student feedback in this space. Okay, so the top quote there is probably one of my favorite quotes about online learning. So I'll let you read that about interactivity, great benefit by e-learning, yet it doesn't engage or instruct. So there's a lot of research in this space, right? That even in an online learning space, and I'm not talking about a MOOC, but a class with an instructor and students, and some intentional design behind it. And the goal of students is to finish the class, and it's not a training, all of this stuff. The most important part of that class is the relationship that students have with their instructor and the instructor effort and care in that class. That's the most important indicator of student satisfaction and perception of like being really engaged in the class. It's not a little slider that moves or an interactive situation, scenario, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, right? It's not the technology at the heart of it. It's the care that the instructor has and the relationship that that instructor builds. So, that can look different in the online space than it does in a traditional classroom, but it's still the most important thing. And then I think it's really interesting to think about how online learning is changing and what these different models look like with online learning what we use and what designs we give in our classes. And some of that was talked about in the first presentation of this two-part presentation with some ungrading ideas. Okay, so we're going to start with audience participation, which is what do you think makes an online learning experience high quality? And I'll give people a minute or two to think about that. And it's an open-ended question, so you can say whatever you think makes online learning high quality. And I can see the responses coming in. So as they come in, I will share them. Okay, good. So I'm going to share everything that's coming in one at a time. So interaction with students, and then there's one about students feeling engaged and connected. Somebody, Karen is very honest in saying doesn't know. Great. Hopefully this presentation give you some insight into that. Engagement of the audience. Another comment about engagement, consistent flow of communication and feedback. Engagement through conversation, Lana said. And then lots of opportunities to practice and ability to choose resources to learn from. That's a good one, CJ, especially the ability to choose resources to learn from. I remember before I got involved in higher ed, I was a teacher in a hybrid charter school, sixth through eighth grade, teaching science, life science, and earth science. And I was so frustrated because we were in this like potentially really cool, innovative space. I had arranged for like a talk from a NASA expert, really excited, and basically was like, actually, we just need to like give them worksheets because they need to take the PSSA, which is the Pennsylvania State test at the end of the year. And so all of these different resources, right, that I could have given them or options to learn from because we're in this like space with so much information really was taken away by the perception of teaching to the test and meeting those standards. So I really like that last point there, right? So I see like some definite themes and trends here, which is like engagement is really important, feedback is really important, and conversation is really important. Okay, so I'm not talking in this presentation to like, oh, you have a 10-person class or a 500-person class or a 200-person class. There's different strategies you can take depending on what size your class is, but thinking about what underpins this quality online learning experience, which is feedback, engagement, conversation, and really building that relationship, I think are critical factors to remember. And there's other things here that we didn't touch on, like making sure your content is accessible and some like basic nuts and bolts of online learning as well. So really, what affects course quality? Perhaps some of you are familiar with Quality Matters or some of these other um, groups or organizations that put out criteria for what makes a quality online learning course. These are the different groups. INICOL, the second one there is really for K-12, but these are the different groups that put out some rubrics, some measures to evaluate online courses and how they can be perceived as quality. And then once you get into, this is a Quality Matters pie, once you get into each one of the pieces of the pie, then you get right a lot more criteria about it. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm focused a lot on thinking about course design, course delivery, and course content, because the other things there, faculty readiness, right, you can do your own professional development, but the other stuff there, you can't really influence too much unless you have some say in the LMS that your institution picks or student readiness assessments or relationships with advisors, right? That kind of goes outside of the scope of designing the course. But here we're going to talk about course design and delivery primarily. Okay, so instructional design in a nutshell, if I say the word instructional design, you probably have a lot of thoughts about what instructional designers do. Some of you might get to work with instructional designers. Some people might not be fortunate to have instructional designers at their institution, or their instructional design unit works in a way that's not necessarily like one-on-one in terms of creating courses with faculty. Um, but instructional designers are an incredibly useful tool. And the way I like to think about instructional designers and different parts of the online learning experience and how it differs from face to face teaching is that when you think about online learning and doing online learning well, it is really a systems based view to online learning. Michael Moore wrote that book there, which is the second point there, systems thinking with online learning. It's a great way to think about online teaching and learning, and a great way to think about how it is different than approaching a face-to-face class, right? When you approach a face-to-face class, you have to think about what you're going to teach, right? You're the subject matter expert, how you're going to engage your students, what you're going to do, what activities you're going to do. Are you going to put them in groups? Are they going to go check out stuff from your media lab? Are they going to create a multimedia in your course? What kind of support do you need for them for that? When it comes to designing an online course, all of a sudden, for the most part, you're in this like team-based environment where you're the subject matter expert, the content matter expert, but you might also be working with an accessibility person and a multimedia person, or that person is the same person, or instructional designer. Maybe you're working with the library to think about how students are evaluating information in this space. You might be working with um, your virtual, like your teaching and learning with technology unit, to think about what kind of technologies you could be using in this online learning space. So it's a systems-based view of online learning. I really like to think about it that way. And if you look at any of the great research, like from Garrison and Abra, the community of inquiry, or anything that kind of George Siemens worked on when he was up at Athabasca University, is now at UT Arlington. Like all of that stuff, I think is a really great holistic approach to online learning. And then some other concepts from instructional systems that I think are helpful. Mole, Amante, and Gonzalez wrote a great article. This was like way back in 2000, before asset-based instruction was, a trendy word. But they wrote an article on funds of knowledge, which is like this inclusive model of leveraging students like home capital and human capital, and bringing that into the online learning space and the classroom space as well. And then andragogy, right? This concept of like how adult learners learn, how they prefer to learn. And it's important to think about that these aren't theories, right? None of these are theories. They're just concepts you can use to help you grapple with designing instruction. And then experiential learning from Kolb also tends to resonate really well with adult learners. So I just wanted to bring these in terms of creating and saving time. These are some strategies, some frameworks, some concepts that you can use to guide your thinking about online teaching and learning. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit into the time. And so I have a question here, which is, why do you think that online learning courses take longer upfront to create than in-person courses? And of course, there's probably always an exception to this rule. But for the most part, in my experience for the past 15 years, this is shown to be true over and over again. When answers start popping in, I will share them again. Okay, so some answers are coming in here. I'll start sharing from the bottom instead of the top. So now CJ will have his answer shared first, or her answer shared first, or their answer shared first. So we have response times to issues are delayed, and anything symbols related can be problematic. Okay. Lana added that she believes it's because they believe it's because the amount of foresight. I'm still learning, right? Inclusive is always like a learning experience. Believe that it's because of the amount of foresight needed to develop on. That's a great point. Karen mentioned unfamiliar technology, which I think ties a little bit into what CJ said, with, symbols are problematic and issues can come up. And then there's a comment about, you have to create lots of things can happen on the fly, right, in an in-person classroom. To see that full comment. And then finally, um, there is, Luli mentioned the comment of starting over with content creation, right? So I think all of these are really good points, and depending on who you are and what institution you're at, they can take dominance over how you think about why online learning courses take longer upfront to create than in-person courses. So I really like that point DJ made about a lot of things like can happen on the fly in an in-person class, right? And the other thing is when you teach an online class, and I'm talking about like a traditional, 15-week undergrad online class or like an accelerated, maybe intensive graduate student online class, you have to at the very beginning of the class, like you need to be done with week 15 before week 1 starts. And theoretically, you might be done with week 15 when week 1 starts because you have a syllabus in an in-person class or you have a learning contract or however you want to call it. But you don't have to have all of your content cut and dry, ready to go, anything like that, right? And you're really starting over in the online space. So when it comes to building an online course, and this is heavily from my experience at Penn State, but you really need, as a course author, subject matter expert, it's really beneficial to have at least a 5-month timeline for development. And sometimes if it's a new course coming out, that timeline can even be stretched to like 12 to 18 months. And when you think about teaching an in-person course, and I've taught both, um, I, of course, take time to think about how I'm going to teach and deliver my in-person course, and over the long haul of the course I probably spend more time on it than I do in my online courses, but I don't spend that much time on it up front. And I think in some ways that's a real advantage, right? Like you can adapt on the fly, you can see what works and what doesn't work. When it comes to uh, an online course, you have to plan ahead, and then things might happen and change, but it takes so long to develop that content to make sure it makes sense. And this is especially true for like an asynchronous course where you're basically writing the student experience without a ton of interaction or intervention from you. So, like misconceptions that come up, you kind of have to anticipate them. You have to think about what that looks like. And I just want you, as we talk about like learning theories and all of these things and different instructional design choices, I think it's really important to remember that like this isn't a lab, this isn't a controlled setting. This is real life with students, and it's messy. And online teaching is no exception to that, even if it does have to be kind of planned ahead of time, right? You can even have weeks locked down. Students can only view 1 week at a time or one lesson at a time and mediate it that way. But you're still leaving a lot of room open for interpretation that you can control a bit more tightly in a face to face classroom. So these are just 4 different choices. Then you think about designing instruction. If you've never really dove into instructional design too deeply, these are 4 good models to start with. ADDIE is probably the most traditional model for instructional design, but these other ones are really popular as well. And in particular, I'm biased to Kemp instructional design model because it's a systems-based view of online learning. Okay, so these are some of the challenges of online course design. So transforming subject matter, right? Lack of learner engagement, being able to use the technology appropriately. We already talked about a lot of stuff in your comments that you gave me. Empowering student voices, I think, is really important. The best online class you would design with students, right? You would have a diverse representation of students who would, prospectively be taking the class, and you would actually, have them design it, maybe write the textbook, design it with them, and you can maybe work towards something like that over time. And it's a little bit harder to think about that the first time you're teaching an online class. But there's tons of great stuff out of like the idea company that talks about involving people in the design of products they use, and I think it can easily translate to education. So what are some synchronous online learning engagement strategies that you can take the time of upfront to then save yourself time in the long run because you've created a quality class? Encouraging students, but not requiring them. If you follow any education stuff, it's always a topic of discussion to turn their camera on. Using tools for capturing student thinking, utilizing breakouts where appropriate. This is in like a synchronous time, right? Um, Give peers time to learn from each other, whether that's in group work or a discussion board or a peer review assignment. Don't rely solely on one way instruction, which is kind of what I'm doing today because we only had 25 minutes together. But in a longer, like 50-minute or even hour, it would be a lot. It could be a lot more interactive and back and forth and breakouts and learning from you, you learning from me, and then providing ample opportunities for feedback. And I'm not talking too much today about like the technologies you can use, right? Like for feedback, you can use GoFormative. For students to comment to each other, you could use hypothesis or something like that. I'm not talking about those tools, right? Because I believe in pedagogy first and technology second. So, of course, we could talk about those tools, but I think having strong pedagogy up front and then deciding what tools you can use to support that pedagogy, that's how I think about using educational technology in the classroom. And then some synchronous online learning strategies, some asynchronous online learning strategies, sorry. Thinking beyond the discussion board. So can you have video-based discussions instead? Are there other tools that might make sense? Particularly if you use Canvas, the discussion board is notoriously horrible to navigate. So can you use something else to kind of make that experience better for the student? The last thing you want to do is have technology take away and take students out of their flow of learning, their cognitive flow of learning. And then I think it's really key just to make yourself available and to make sure that you build a sense of community, which is not so easily done in the asynchronous learning environment. And there's a very popular saying in the instructional design world, which is that content is king, but not without strong pedagogy, right? So students are paying for your content, expertise. This is a class they have to take. They want to learn the content, but you're an expert. The way you think about the content is quite different than the way a student is going to think about that content. So you need to think about how people learn and how students are grappling with that content, not how experts think about it. And finally, assessing and gaining student feedback. I think it's really important in terms of creating a quality online experience and saving time is to gather student feedback as much as you can, without feeling like you're being invasive, saying like, here's a survey, here's a survey, here's a survey, here's a survey. Using tools that are readily available to you. Consider using activities that create data for you. So it's not like the students always feeling like they're giving the feedback. And then allowing students to make comments to you and however you want to accept them throughout the semester, not just waiting till, summative course evaluations. Just like you give formative assessments to your students, you should expect formative feedback from your students. Don't wait until the end of the semester, because even though you do have to design online learning upfront, if you obviously if something breaks, you fix it. But if you catch something from students that, oh, a lot of students are saying this, or like, oh, I never really thought about this content that way, you can still, tweak and adjust things slightly in the online space to better meet the class. So that's my contact information. Welcome any emails or comments anytime. Like I said, I've been in online learning for a while. I specialize in digital credentials and micro credentials primarily, as well as systems based thinking. And so, finally, just what is one takeaway you can bring back to your thinking about teaching and student learning when it comes to online space based on this presentation today or something this presentation triggered in you? Give people a few seconds here to fill this out if they want to, and then pop back.